Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, brilliant politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon remains something of an enigma, at times a hopeless romantic idealist, and the bitterest of cynics. His iron will, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. As Egypt had been Muslim since the 7th century, Napoleon felt it would be wise to embrace Islam as much as possible. Napoleon certainly respected Islam and had read the Quran on the voyage out, which he found sublime, and he saw it as not just religious. It is civil and political. The Bible only preaches morals. As an 18th century rationalist and an admirer of Voltaire, Napoleon believed that men are brothers and share a belief in a benevolent God. Only the doctrinal barriers that had been made by priests and theologians prevented the union of all mankind from worshipping together the one God who made them. Napoleon found nothing in the Quran to conflict with this belief. He said of Islam, "Muhammad appeared at a moment when all men were anxious to be authorized to believe in only one God. A man can be only a man, but sometimes as a man he can accomplish great things. He is often like a spark among inflammable material. I do not think that Muhammad would, at the present time, succeed in Arabia, but in his own day, his religion in 10 years conquered half the known world. Whilst it took 3 centuries for the religion of Christ firmly to establish itself, the religion of Christ is too subtle for Orientals. They want something more definite, less spiritual." Napoleon was also impressed by the way that the Muslims tore more souls from false gods, toppled more idols in 15 years than the followers of Christ and Moses had in 15 centuries. Napoleon even had no objection to polygamy, which was more common among Muslims at the time, saying that Egyptian men were gourmands en amour, and when permitted, will prefer having wives of various colours. Indeed, Napoleon would later come up with the idea, with an unknown degree of seriousness, that polygamy be allowed in the French Caribbean colonies. He thought that letting men have wives of different colours would resolve racial problems, as it would result in their children being of different races and yet growing up as kindred. He even once told a French bishop of this idea, but Monseigneur would hear none of it. Aware that religion was a primordial factor in Egyptian politics, Napoleon first tried to win the support of the religious leaders. He discussed theology with the muftis, flattered the ulama clergy, and told them that he admired Muhammad. To win over the people and to show his respect for local religion and culture, Napoleon personally attended all the traditional festivals and ceremonies. He took steps to specially protect pilgrims travelling to Mecca and was friendly towards the leaders of the celebrated Al-Azhar University, who he encouraged in pursuing their studies. Largely through this religious broad-mindedness, Napoleon succeeded in occupying and peaceably governing a country twice as large as France. At the news of the destruction of the French fleet, the Egyptian people remained calm, at least outwardly. To distract them from the disaster, Napoleon organized a month filled with festivities. When he discovered that the imams of Cairo, Rosetta, and elsewhere were not intending to celebrate the Prophet's birthday that year, pleading lack of money, but really indicating to the faithful that they thought the French were hostile to one of the most sacred acts of their religion, Napoleon insisted that the French would pay for everything, despite his own shortage of funds. The celebrations began on the 20th of August and lasted 3 days, with coloured lanterns on poles, processions to mosques, music, poetry chanting, sideshows featuring bears and monkeys, magicians who made live snakes disappear, and illuminated representations of the Prophet's tomb in Medina. To honour the Prophet's birthday itself, the French fired salutes and fireworks, and a regimental band joined the crowds, as the French officers were presented to a cleric, Saïd Khalil al-Bakri, who Napoleon decided to declare the most senior of Muhammad's descendants. Napoleon then quoted the Prophet Muhammad from memory, who passed through all the heavens in a night, and came out with lines such as, "Evil, thrice evil to those who search for perishable riches, who covet gold and silver, which resemble dross." At a feast of 100 clerics, at which the French were specially allowed to drink wine, and where he ate with his bare hands, as was the custom, Napoleon was declared a son-in-law of the Prophet, with the name Ali Bonaparte. The Egyptians were humouring him, and he them. As one French officer recalled, the soldiers were politic in their expressions. When they returned to their lodgings, they laughed at the comedy. But this was Napoleon's serious attempt to elicit support from the Egyptians. Though he never went so far as his general he called that fool Manu, who converted to Islam, married an Egyptian, and took the middle name Abdallah. Napoleon announced in a proclamation, "Cadis, sheikhs, imams, tell the people that we too are true Muslims. Are we not the men who have destroyed the Pope, who preached eternal war against the Muslims? Are we not those who have destroyed the Knights of Malta, because those madmen believed that they should constantly make war on your faith?" Later, when announcing French victories, Napoleon took a similar line, a firm believer in providence. To the Egyptians, Napoleon attributed French successes to Allah, and described himself as one destined by the Almighty to drive the Turks, and their accessories, the Mamelukes, out of Egypt. He claimed that his reading of the Quran had led him to believe that the will of Muhammad was for the Egyptians to join the French in defeating the Mamelukes, and that the Prophet favoured trade with the Franks, supported their efforts to reach India, and wanted the French to have depots in Egyptian ports. For this, Napoleon promised, "The friendship of the Franks will be your reward, until you ascend to the seventh heaven and sit beside the black-eyed Horus, always young and always maidens." When one of the clerics pointed out that he had treated the Pope with kindness and had refrained from deposing him, Napoleon replied that His Holiness had been wrong to condemn Muslims to eternal hellfire. Then Napoleon put in a request to the muftis. Would they announce in the mosques that the French were true Muslims like themselves, and advise all Egyptians to take an oath of loyalty to his government? The muftis replied that if the French were truly Muslims, they must undergo circumcision and no longer drink wine. Napoleon decided that this would be taking adaptation a little too far. Later, Napoleon would often joke about how close he had come to embracing Islam, and that he did in fact convince the Amans to let them off with renouncing wine and circumcision, under the condition that they did a good deed after each drink. A compromise was reached, where Napoleon agreed to pay for the building of a mosque, a cheap price under the circumstances. In a euphoric mood, he enthused that he would build a mosque half a league long, where he and his entire army could worship. Napoleon would continue to protect Islam, and the Muftis issued a limited but extremely useful statement describing Napoleon as God's messenger, the worthy son of the Prophet, the favourite of Allah, and even introduced his praises into their litany and chanted in the mosques, "Who is he that hath saved the favourite of victory from the dangers of the sea and from the rage of his enemies? Who is he that hath led the brave men of the West, safe and unharmed, to the banks of the Nile? It is Allah, the great Allah." The Mamelukes put their trust in horses. They draw forth their infantry in battle array, but the favourite of victory hath destroyed the footmen and the horsemen of the Mamelukes. As the vapours which rise in the morning are scattered by the rays of the sun, so have the army of the Mamelukes been scattered by the brave men of the West. For the brave men of the West are as the apple of the eye to the great Allah. Nicholas the Turk, an Arab eyewitness and historian, said that many Muslims assumed that Napoleon was the Mahdi, guided one, who was expected to redeem Islam. And many more would have believed so had Napoleon worn Middle Eastern rather than Western clothing, a surprising oversight. Napoleon happened to like their dress. Once he tried it on, turban, ankle-length robe, and crescent dagger, but it provoked laughter among his officers, and Talleyrand, who edited Napoleon's weekly newspaper, cast a cold Republican eye on this Eastern garb, and on his advice, Napoleon did not wear it again. Years later, Napoleon said to a courtier's wife, "Do you not think the Empire of the East, and perhaps the subjection of the whole of Asia, were not worth a turban and loose trousers? The army would undoubtedly have lent itself to this joke." Asked 2 decades later whether he had ever truly embraced Islam, as his enemies liked to rumour that he had actually converted, Napoleon laughed and replied, "Fighting is a soldier's religion. I never changed that. The other is the affair of women and priests. As for me, I always adopt the religion of the country I am in." Napoleon had intended to return to France once the conquest of Egypt was secure. But on the 8th of September, he wrote to the Directory, "I can't possibly return to Paris in October as I promised, but the delay will only last a few months. All is going on well here. The country is subdued and is becoming accustomed to us. The rest must be the work of time." Yet, Napoleon was being somewhat misleading, as Egypt was not quite accustomed to French rule. After some minor disturbances in the Nile Delta, his letters to his officers does refer to the occasional beheadings, hostage-taking, and village burning that the French had to employ to secure its presence. At the time, these were the standard methods of controlling potentially hostile areas in the East. For example, the British Army then in India routinely restored tranquility, as one witness of the Duke of Wellington's campaigns there put it, usually by the wanton torching of villages and stealing of livestock. Unsurprisingly, many Egyptians still saw the French as foreign occupiers and infidels. Al-Jabati felt that the French invasion was God's punishment on Egypt for disobeying Islamic principles. He saw the French as the new crusaders, and Napoleon as a grasping conqueror, an untrustworthy atheist. Still, Al-Jabati also made no secret of his admiration for French weaponry, military tactics, medical advances, science, and interest in Egyptian history, geography, and culture. He appreciated how well the French treated local workers in their building projects. He enjoyed his interaction with the French scholars, and he followed their scientific experiments with interest, and was impressed by Napoleon's lack of ostentation and self-denial in not taking a harem. Yet, he was unimpressed that the French soldiers failed to haggle in the souks, thinking it was their way of trying to ingratiate themselves with the people, and was disgusted by the way the French allowed the lowliest Copts, Syrians, and Orthodox Christians and Jews to ride horses and carry swords, in transgression of Islamic laws. Indeed, the French Revolution's principle of equality offended against much of the Quran. And al-Jabati was delighted when, in September 1798, the Sultan of Turkey finally retaliated against the French invasion of Egypt, his richest province. He did nothing less than declare a jihad, or holy war, against the French. As the news spread, now the situation in Egypt was set to explode. Disguised as beggars or traders, Turkish and English spies surveyed the Nile Valley, encouraging local religious fanaticism and calling for the Egyptians to revolt. Their aim was to present the French as rascally infidels who had no respect for any religion, let alone Islam. Along with discreet bribes, they succeeded in influencing even the ulemas of the Al-Azhar Mosque. A widespread conspiracy was formed, embracing the allies of the Mamelukes and Turks. All over the land, conspirators with scimitar and daggers planned to kill every Frenchman in Egypt. Few troops were stationed in Cairo at the time, oblivious to the danger, and the French were scattered all over the country, busy in their projects and research. Starting in Alexandria and the Delta, the uprising rapidly spread to Cairo. During the night of the 20th of October, 1798, 30 conspirators met secretly in the Al-Azhar Mosque to finalize the details of a revolt. The next morning at dawn, the muezzins called from their minarets, exhorting the people to a jihad. Let all those who believe there is only one God take themselves to the Al-Azhar Mosque, for today is the day to fight the infidel. Led by provocateurs, a furious mob seized cutlasses and spread throughout the neighborhoods, taking by surprise and murdering French traders and soldiers and killing scholars. Muslims suspected of collaborating with the French also suffered the same fate. One of the first of the French to be slain was General Dupuy, the military governor of Cairo, who came across the crowds building barricades, was attacked and lanced to death in the street. A rumor spread that it was not Dupuy, but Napoleon himself who had been killed, which inflamed the rebellion almost as much as the muezzins had. Within an hour, the entire city was up in arms. At 5 a.m. that morning, Napoleon was woken up by the announcement that the city was in a state of open revolt. Mounted Bedouin tribesmen were crowding in at the gates to reinforce the uprising, and several French officers and many soldiers had already been assassinated. Napoleon immediately ordered an aide-de-camp to take some of his personal guard and retake the city with maximum force. Just a few minutes later, one of them returned covered in blood and informed Napoleon that all the other 15 guards had been slain, including his trusted aide, Sorkovsky. The rebels then fed their bodies to dogs. Mounting his horse, with an entourage of only 30 of his guard, Napoleon, according to Bourrienne, advanced on all threatened points, restored confidence, and with great presence of mind, adopted measures of defence. Napoleon's most important objective was to keep hold of the Cairo citadel, which then, as now, commanded the city with its towering height and 10-foot thick walls. A fierce storm of grape-shot, cannonballs and bombshells swept the streets, and the rebels fled to seek cover in the most populated parts of the city. Napoleon's troops pursued them, with the rebels fighting desperately from the windows and roofs. Don Martin shelled their positions for over 36 hours, until buildings were soon enveloped in flames. The French did not manage to restore order until the end of the second day of violence, when the Grand Mosque, where many of the conspirators had taken refuge, surrendered after being bombarded for several hours by 15 cannon, and was then stormed by infantry. The rebellion cost the lives of 300 Frenchmen, including several scholars and senior officers, but the rebels suffered more than 2,500 dead. The French army had just shown its strength, which, in the local mind, used as they were to the brutal Mamelukes, instilled not just fear, but also respect. Tallien, the Directory's representative, urged Napoleon to punish them by setting fire to all mosques and killing all the clerics. Napoleon, of course, did nothing of the sort, but he did finish the affair in Eastern style, showing himself to be both merciful and merciless. Napoleon granted mercy to all those who were not captured with weapons in hand, and ostentatiously pardoned the local sheikhs and imams of the El-Azhar Mosque, with the words, "I know that many of you have been weak, but I like to believe that none of you is guilty." By contrast, the ringleaders and conspirators who'd been caught in the act of murder or plunder were tried and publicly executed. Their bodies were thrown into the Nile and carried towards the sea, while their heads were put in sacks, loaded onto mules, and dumped in piles in Escapia Square in central Cairo. An eyewitness recalled, "I cannot describe the horror, but I must confess that it had the effect for a considerable time of ensuring tranquility." Such brutal examples ensured that, unlike the Zealots, the ordinary people of Cairo did not rise up en masse against the French, who could not have resisted 500,000 people. Satisfying the local customs, Napoleon's energy in annihilating the murderers of the French sent a thrill through Egypt, striking the people's imagination, and the rumour spread that Allah favoured the Sultan al-Kabir, who had appeared to punish the criminal people of Cairo. Napoleon then let the rebellion die down of its own accord. A week later, order had been fully restored. There was not a repeat. Neither the Turks or Arabs dared to raise the dagger against Napoleon again. And on the 11th of November, Napoleon forbade the old Eastern torture method of the bastinado, caning the soles of the feet, which was especially painful because of the large number of nerve endings, small bones and tendons there, and was even meted out to women. Napoleon ordered to Berthier that the barbarous custom of having men beaten who are suspected of having important secrets to reveal must be abolished. Torture produces nothing worthwhile. The poor wretches say anything that comes into their mind that the interrogator wants to hear. But, as a precaution, Napoleon ordered a series of forts to be built around Cairo to command the city. And Egypt remained loyal, while he gathered his strength to face the combined armies of Turkey, England, and now, unexpectedly, Russia. Even while he was continuing to lay the foundations of France's Eastern Empire, in the midst of his victory at the Battle of the Pyramids, his triumphal entry into Cairo, and his revolution of Egypt, privately, it is clear that Napoleon wanted to give it all up. Reeling from the revelation of Josephine's infidelity, a week after hearing the news, Napoleon had tried to comfort himself by writing a deeply personal letter to his favourite confidant, his brother Joseph. "The veil is torn asunder. You are the only person remaining to me. I treasure your friendship. I can be in France in 2 months. Have a country house ready for me when I return, either close to Paris or in Burgundy. I count on locking myself up and spending the winter there. It is sad when one and the same heart is torn by such conflicting feelings for one person. I am weary of human nature. I need to be alone. I am tired of grandeur. All my feelings are dried up. I no longer care about my glory. At the age of 29, I have exhausted everything. Life has nothing more to offer. There is nothing left for me but to think only of myself. But even this letter to his brother, which had helped to ease his grief, was about to be turned against Napoleon and only redoubled his pain. In the middle of October, despite Admiral Nelson's promise that all non-military communications that were captured by his ships, letters of a confidential, personal or romantic nature, would be released and forwarded to their addresses, the English government allowed Napoleon's personal letters to be published in England in November. One editorial in the Morning Chronicle complained that this did little credit to the ethics of our cabinet and declared it scandal-mongering. Captured in the same dispatch pouch, Eugène had sent a letter to his mother, Josephine, warning her that Napoleon had heard the rumours of her infidelity, a letter which was also published in England. My dearest mother, for the last 5 days, Bonaparte has appeared exceedingly sad, and this came as a result of a talk he had with Junot. From the few words I could catch, it all goes back to Hippolyte, to the fact that he returned with you from Italy in your carriage, that it was he who gave you your little dog, that he is with you even at this moment. As you can imagine, maman, I do not believe a word of this. But what is certain is that the general is deeply affected by it. Still, he redoubles his kindness towards me. By his actions, he seemed to be saying that children cannot be held responsible for their mother's frailties. But your son tells himself that all this is gossip fabricated by your enemies. I only hope that by the time you arrive here, all this will be forgotten. Back in France, Barras persuaded most of the French newspapers not to reprint the 2 letters. But since the French edition of the Chronicle newspaper was already available, the damage was done. By December, all of France knew that Napoleon was aware of his wife's affair. Napoleon and Josephine's marital rift had become a public scandal. One of Napoleon's key traits was that he hated being made a fool out of, and he immediately looked for some way of freeing himself from the role of inconsolable husband. From Egypt, he could not proceed with the glaring public divorce he said he wanted from Josephine, but at least he could show that he was not the most ridiculous of men, a heartbroken general. Napoleon had always been faithful to Josephine in the past, but he saw no reason to be now. But in Egypt, the local women concealed everything but their eyes, and several French soldiers left on record how they found the available Egyptian women unattractive. And those that did reveal more, the dancers, were not viewed very highly by the suddenly strangely moralistic French soldiers. In common with many of his officers and men, for the last 6 months or so, Napoleon had been without female company. Bernoyer, in a letter written home at this time, reflected the general opinion among Napoleon's officers. Since we have been in Egypt, he has had no particular liaison with a woman, and we are all surprised that in such a hot country he has never shown any desire to have one. However, according to Bourrienne, towards mid-September, Napoleon had half a dozen Asiatic women brought to him at his Cairo palace, all of who were praised for their beauty and grace. But he did not care for this sort of thing, and was repelled by their ungraceful obesity, so he immediately sent them back. Napoleon once described his ideal vision of a woman as slender and graceful, in a white dress, walking along a tree-lined path. In other words, Josephine. The closest semblance to this came in December, in the form of a pretty and spirited blonde Frenchwoman who turned Napoleon's head. In the harbour of Toulon, about 300 French women had been on board the ships setting sail for Egypt. Many, like seamstresses and laundresses, were officially authorised to be there. But although strict orders had been issued against wives and mistresses joining, several had been smuggled on board the ships, disguised as men, wearing the uniforms of their husbands and lovers. These women were carefree and ready for adventure, and some could even handle a gun as well as any soldier. One of the prettiest among them was a fair-haired 20-year-old beauty called Pauline, who had been smuggled on board the ship by her husband, Lieutenant Fourés. Born in the south of France, Pauline was the daughter of a clockmaker and ended up working as a milliner in Paris until she met her future husband, a dashing cavalryman on sick leave. But their honeymoon was cut short by Fourés' call-up for the Egyptian campaign. One of Pauline's admirers described her as a charming creature with great blue eyes surmounted by eyebrows as black as ebony, which formed a striking contrast to her magnificent head of hair. Her golden hair was said, when she was undressed, to fall to her waist and envelop her entire body like a cloak. No doubt the chance for any, even platonic female company made any suspicious troops turn a blind eye to her presence in Egypt, and many of them were apparently in love with her. On the 1st of December, a fête was held on Escapia Square, which featured a hot air balloon being launched to impress the people of Cairo, who were, however, so unimpressed that they hardly turned their heads to look at it. While Napoleon was watching the preparations for the event, he happened to overhear his teenage stepson, Eugène, pointing out a strikingly pretty woman among the French spectators, a young blonde woman with blue eyes, whose dress flew in the wind, revealing perfectly shaped legs. Looking over, Napoleon was smitten by Pauline at first sight. That night, in hope of seeing her again, Napoleon turned up at the Tivoli Egyptian garden, where she was playing a card game with a group of officers and ladies. Many noticed that Napoleon could not take his eyes off Pauline. They were introduced, and aware of the many eyes watching them, chatted awkwardly for a while. Then, Napoleon brought the conversation to an end and left. The next day, Pauline was invited to a dinner party held by one of the generals. But sending her this solo invitation was a breach of etiquette. It was improper to invite a married woman to dinner without her husband. Lieutenant Fourés thought it odd, perhaps an oversight, but Pauline accepted the invitation anyway. That night, after the dinner, a clatter of horses' hoofs were heard outside. Then the door was flung open, and in walked Napoleon, with 2 aides-de-camp at his heels. The host thanked Napoleon for honouring him with a visit. "The ladies have been such excellent company," he added knowingly, and invited Napoleon to have coffee with them. Napoleon accepted. While drinking his coffee, he again took long looks at Pauline, so persistently that she began to blush. Clearly thinking he had made his intentions plain, as soon as coffee was finished, Napoleon got up and left, without having said a single word to her. Napoleon sent his loyal aide, General Junot, to discreetly convey his feelings to Pauline. But the bold and brash Junot did not prove up to the sensitive task, and his indelicate proposal that she become Napoleon's mistress was rebuffed. The blunder was smoothed over by one of Napoleon's more diplomatic aides, the ultra-charming General Duroc, along with an apology gift of an expensive jewel-encrusted bracelet. It became apparent that Pauline was not in love with her rather jealous husband, and that their relationship had been rocky. But although she was flattered by the attentions of the Commander-in-Chief himself, it was clear that Napoleon and Pauline could not see each other while her husband was still in Cairo. The obliging Berthier was given the task of getting rid of Pauline's husband, and on the 17th of December, Napoleon told him to arrange for the lieutenant to be sent away on an important mission, carrying dispatches to the Directory in Paris. Such an errand would see Lieutenant Fourés out of Cairo for at least 3 months, possibly much longer. Curious to know what Berthier had said to convince the lieutenant to leave without his wife, Napoleon had him repeat the conversation, and as Berthier retold it, "My dear Fourés, more fortunate than the rest of us, you are about to see France once more. You will leave immediately. Here are orders for the commandant. Well, bon voyage. I wish I were in your shoes." But when Fourés then said he would go home first to tell his wife, and prepare her for the voyage too, Berthier, struggling not to give anything away, told him he must leave immediately, and that, as the army did not recognize wives in Egypt, He would have to travel alone to Paris. Your wife? My dear fellow, what madness! How could you dream of taking your wife with you? She would be exceedingly ill on the little ship, and then the voyage is not without danger. Suppose you were captured by an English cruiser. English officers have an eye for the fairer sex. They do not, as you know, stand on ceremony with women, and they might perhaps treat Madame Fourés not precisely like a prisoner of war. Hang it all, when a man has been the whole month at sea, you know. Fourés believed him, said goodbye to his wife, and was on his way to Alexandria within a few hours. Pauline was now free from her husband's observation, and Napoleon wasted no time. That very night, he invited Pauline and some other officers and their wives to a dinner party at his palace. Pauline was seated next to Napoleon, and once again he was completely wrapped up in her. During the meal, a servant accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, spilled a jug of water over Pauline's dress. Napoleon leapt to her rescue, offering to take her to his quarters to repair the damage, and led her upstairs. They were gone for 2 hours. The other dinner guests tried to make polite conversation, but they were not especially surprised by their disappearance. Napoleon's interest in Pauline had already become common knowledge, and the guests discreetly pretended not to notice their dishevelled appearance when they eventually returned to the dinner table. As soon as her husband was out of the picture, Pauline gave herself up completely to Napoleon, who moved his new mistress into a villa next to his palace. Napoleon made no secret of their relationship. As he was well aware, word would get back to Paris sooner or later, and to Josephine, which was doubtless what he intended. To the glee of his troops, Pauline, who they nicknamed the Generals Cleopatra and Our Lady of the Orient, would travel with Napoleon wherever he went, riding next to him on a matching white Arabian horse which had been specially trained for her, while she was dressed in a general's uniform, figure-fitting white breeches, Napoleon's famous hat on her head, and around her neck hung his portrait. "There's our generaless," the soldiers would shout. After dinner, Napoleon and Pauline would often go for an open carriage ride with 2 aides-de-camp prancing at their side. Sometimes, this duty fell to Eugène, Josephine's son, who pointed out the abnormality of the situation to his stepfather. At last, unable to endure it any longer, Eugène applied for a transfer, which caused a heated scene with Napoleon, but he agreed to limit his public outings with his mistress, and Eugène was exempted from duty during them. Though flaunted in broad daylight, their affair surprisingly caused very little scandal. Pauline acted as Napoleon's hostess at his official dinners at the luxurious palace, organizing picnics in the desert, parties and receptions. Junot recalled, she had plenty of wit and longed to occupy a prominent position, but she coupled with all this a total ignorance of the ways of society, of manners which betoken good breeding and refinement. Junot's wife later heard a lot about her. She was just as thoughtless and light-hearted as a child of 12. Napoleon sometimes used to quiz her about her laughter, and he would amusedly tease her about her liaisons with other officers. He would not have done so, even in jest, had he thought there was the slightest truth in what he said. As a matter of fact, there was not. Still, all did not go according to plan. Lieutenant Fourés was to return much sooner than either Napoleon or Pauline had expected. Fourés's ship was intercepted by an English frigate. According to some sources, the English, who had an efficient spy network in Egypt, had quickly found out about Napoleon's affair with Fourés's wife and sent him back on purpose, hoping to embarrass the French commander-in-chief. Landing back in Alexandria, Fourés was coolly received by Marmont, but when the lieutenant demanded to be allowed to return to Cairo, Marmont let him, thinking there was no way to keep Pauline's infidelity from her husband anyway, when every soldier in the army knew about it. In early January, Fourés unexpectedly returned to Cairo to find his house empty and his wife gone. His fellow officers told him what had been happening, and in classic military fashion, Fourés grabbed a horsewhip and went in search of his wife. bursting into her villa on the palace grounds. He discovered Pauline in the bath, flew into a rage at her refusal to return home with him, and, according to one account, began beating her with his whip until he drew blood, and the servants rushed in and had to restrain him. Fourés would be officially reprimanded for conduct unbecoming an officer. Luckily for the lieutenant, Napoleon was away on a trip to Suez at the time. If not, the lieutenant might have been dragged before his commander to receive a more severe punishment in the heat of the moment. Pauline applied for a divorce a few days later to protect herself against his brutality, which in Egypt was not a complicated process, and was granted within a few hours. Pauline adopted her maiden name and became Napoleon's official mistress. Napoleon's feelings towards Pauline seem to have been something more than just a fling or revenge on Josephine. The affair did deflect charges of being a cuckold from Napoleon, which, for a French general, was a much more damaging accusation than his own adultery. But Napoleon also did encourage Pauline to divorce her husband, and even went as far as confiding in his staff officers about his feelings for her. According to some, Napoleon even entertained the idea of marrying Pauline, despite the fact that she had already been unfaithful to her last husband, which was hardly a good omen. But having married Josephine, whose childbearing days might already be over, Napoleon was determined to know whether her potential successor could give him children. According to Bourrienne, Bonaparte had his heart set on having a child with this beautiful woman. I used to speak to him about it during the tete-a-tete luncheons which we often had together. "What's to be done?" he would reply. "This silly girl can't do it." As it turned out, Napoleon was correct, as Pauline would not have any children with any of her 3 husbands. Napoleon spent his first 6 months in Egypt developing the country, and immediately took measures to protect, inventory, study, and publicize the archaeological treasures of Egyptian civilization. A month after arriving in Cairo, on the 22nd of August 1798, Napoleon had organized the famous Institute of Egypt to diffuse the Enlightenment and the sciences of Europe, and to organize his scholars' research, which would become the starting point of the study of Egyptology. His close friend, Monge, was made president, and Napoleon himself accepted the office of vice president. A man from the working class, Monge's father had been a knife grinder, but at 14, Monge had invented the fire engine, and at 27 had saved France from certain defeat with a new technique for converting church bells into guns. At the Institute's opening session, Napoleon suggested very practical subjects as its topics, like how the army's baking could be improved. Was there any substitute for hops in the brewing of beer? Could Nile water be made drinkable? Were watermills or windmills better for Cairo? Could Egypt produce gunpowder? And what was the state of Egyptian law and education? He also suggested they should select sites where grapevines could be grown, seek the best way of getting water for the citadel of Cairo, select spots for wells in different parts of the desert. The Institute's headquarters was large enough to house their library, laboratories, an antiquarian collection, and menagerie, and they met every 5 days. The hall where the mathematics seminars were held had once been the Bey's harem. Conte, the chief balloonist, was put in charge of the workshops, which, among other things, produced spare parts for windmills, clocks, and the printing press. One of the scholars, the 26-year-old Saint-Hilaire, described the atmosphere at the Institute. "I found here men who thought of nothing but the sciences. I lived at the center of a dedicated group of intellectual lights. We earnestly studied all the questions that interested us, the government and the sciences, to which we had voluntarily dedicated ourselves." Napoleon divided his time in Cairo between influential Egyptians and his scholars, spending so much of his time with the latter that his army officers grew jealous of the Pekingese dogs, as they dubbed the scholars, because most had grown thick moustaches, for the Egyptians saw being clean-shaven as the sign of a slave. Napoleon also wanted the scholars, who had their own newspaper, to teach Egyptians the benefits of windmills, scissors, wheelbarrows, and handsaws, which, incredibly, was all unknown to them until they were introduced by Napoleon. Napoleon tried to use Enlightenment science and reason to win over the Egyptians, and even suggested building an astronomical observatory. The French made full use of their printing press, medical instruments, telescopes, clocks, electricity, balloons, and other modern wonders to try to awe them, which, Algebati readily admitted, did baffle the mind. Napoleon invited the people of Cairo to visit the Institute's workshops, where Conte manufactured everything from potassium nitrate to bugles. But it was all too new to the Egyptians, who felt sure that Conte must be an alchemist, transmuting lead into gold. And when he put on display a hot air balloon as it rose into the sky and drifted into the Nile, the Egyptians nodded their heads wisely and muttered, "These French are in league with the devil." Indeed, none of it seemed to promote the French cause politically. When Berthollet demonstrated a chemical experiment at the Institute, a sheikh asked him whether it could allow him to be in Morocco and Egypt at the same time. Berthollet replied with a Gallic shrug, which led the sheikh to conclude, "Ah well, he isn't such a sorcerer after all." The Institute also participated in organising and developing the country, overseeing the building of mills, furnaces, roads and canals, and solving the problem of supplying Cairo with enough food. Napoleon had new mills built all over the country to raise water and grind corn for bread, which, by the building of public ovens, became abundant. Some of the Institute's members were tasked with creating an accurate description and a perfect map of Egypt. Others were to study the country's resources so that they could be economically developed. Others were to explore the ruins, to try to shed new light on the history. Others to study the social condition of the inhabitants and come up with ideas to promote their welfare. Engineers, draftsmen and scientists dispersed through all the provinces of Egypt. Saltpeter and gunpowder mills were built, a foundry was constructed, large shops were built for locksmiths, armourers, joiners, cartwrights, carpenters and rope makers. Silver goblets and plates were manufactured. Napoleon and Monge set members of the Institute a variety of projects. Extensive research was conducted in archaeology, botany, geology and zoology. Berthollet studied Egyptian techniques of manufacturing indigo. Norrie measured Pompey's column. Sauvigny discovered an unknown species of blue water lily. Villauteur made research into Arabic music. The surgeon Larrey studied ophthalmia, which was endemic in Egypt, noticed that the right eye was more affected than the left, and put this down to the Egyptians' habit of sleeping on their right side, and more likely to be affected by damp. Berthollet, a reserved chemist, spent weeks at the Natron Lakes of the Libyan desert. Here he studied a chemical phenomenon. Berthollet showed that chemical changes depend in part upon the masses of the reacting substances, and so came close to forming the laws of mass action. Saint-Hilaire was the Institute's zoologist, who had previously founded the zoo in Paris's Botanical Gardens. He had also written, with Cuvier, a masterpiece on the orangutan. Though of delicate health, an attack of ophthalmia blinded him for 4 weeks. Saint-Hilaire made detailed studies of crocodiles, the ostrich, and of the polypterus, a Nile fish then unknown to Europe, which resembles certain mammals. By collecting mummified objects and ibises from the tombs of Thebes, he became the first man to study a species over several thousand years old. By these, and other studies in comparative anatomy, Saint-Hilaire gave precision to Lamarck's theory of evolution, and so helped pave the way for Darwin. Napoleon's quest for knowledge also had its amusing side. One time, he asked the artist Rigaud to make first-hand drawings of the Nubians, the most backwards people of Egypt, dressed in their native costume. Rigaud set to work, but as soon as the men saw his drawings of them, they took fright. "He's taken my head! He's taken my arm!" they shouted, and ran away. Napoleon also, in a smaller way, took part in the scientific fieldwork. The task he set himself was to study the ruined Suez Canal, which, in ancient times, under Ramesses II, had connected the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Little could he have guessed that his own nephew, Emperor Napoleon III, would be involved in rebuilding it over half a century later. Napoleon worked on the project with one of his close friends, General Caffarelli of the Engineers. A fair man, born the eldest of 10 children, Caffarelli had refused his rights as the eldest child, who always inherited the biggest part of the parents' wealth. Instead, he'd had the inheritance divided equally between his siblings. Caffarelli, like Napoleon, was both a theorist and a practical man. A philosopher, he startled the Institute with a learned paper in which he claimed that all property was a form of theft, while from his workshops he could create anything. In Egypt, Caffarelli was well known and loved by the army. He had a wooden leg, and when they were feeling homesick, his troops would say wryly, "Caffarelli's all right, he's got one foot in France." When, on the 24th of December, Napoleon set off for Suez, as well as a suitably large armed escort to ward off any Bedouin attacks, he was joined by several scholars, including the ever-faithful Monge and Berthollet, who had both by now signed their names to so many of Napoleon's projects in Egypt that the army was convinced that Monge Berthollet was a single person. But the trip to Suez was to be no grand procession, as Al-Jabati makes clear. Napoleon took with him neither servants, nor a cook, nor a mattress. As their provisions, they carried just 3 roast chickens wrapped in paper. The soldiers had bread, which they carried on the ends of their bayonets. As Bourrienne recalled, conditions were not easy. We had proof during the day of the great heat of the desert, but by 11 o'clock at night, the cold made itself felt in equally fierce fashion. Napoleon and his entourage followed the ancient caravan route taken by pilgrims and merchants through the centuries, which was marked only by the bones and remains of previous travellers. Bourrienne wrote of the macabre picture of how they made their fires at night in the desert. In place of firewood, of which there was none, we gathered large quantities of human and animal debris of all sorts. Monge was made to sacrifice several of the extraordinary heads that he had noticed en route, and placed in the Commander-in-Chief's carriage for safekeeping. 3 days later, Napoleon arrived at Suez, only to find that this once thriving port was a shadow of its former self. The sleepy town and its custom house had a run-down air, and the shipbuilding yard was derelict. Suez now only came to life during the yearly pilgrimage to Mecca, when boats sailed down the Gulf and across the Red Sea. Although a few boats brought coffee from Yemen and merchandise from Muscat, the port that had once flourished with trade from the Far East and East Africa was now little more than an outpost. Suez's decline had begun in the 16th century, after the Portuguese had opened up the route around the Cape of Good Hope. And then the remnants of their trade to the Mediterranean had been further ruined by the greed of the Mamelukes, who charged excessive customs taxes, and the predations of the Bedouin tribes roaming the area. Undeterred, Napoleon harked back to history. The early Mamelukes, as well as the 16th century Ottoman ruler, Suleiman the Magnificent, had launched large fleets from here to sail to India. Napoleon would have liked to do the same. "It is my intention to have as many armed ships as possible on the Red Sea." Standing on the empty quayside, looking out to sea, Napoleon elaborated his plans to his entourage. He intended, he said, to reopen the shipbuilding yards. There would not be enough time to build an invasion fleet, but there might be some time to assemble some frigates, which would be able to open a communications link with any army marching overland to India. Napoleon then ordered the rebuilding of several fortifications and improvements to the maritime faculties, and then went around the town, meeting various merchants from Yemen and Muscat, in the ever-optimistic belief that he could form friendly contact with their rulers. Napoleon carried out many surveys with the engineers and topographers of the Institute, and after inspecting the sand-covered vestiges of the old canal, Napoleon would later entrust the engineer, Lapeyre, with surveying the old Suez Canal isthmus. And his detailed report was to be one of the key documents in the decision, many years later, to build a new canal. Napoleon also proposed that a direct route should be set, not incorporating the Nile, which would later be the same one adopted by the Frenchman, Rosetta, who rebuilt the canal in 1864, which revolutionized world trade. Meanwhile, Monge, Berthollet and their fellow scholars set out along the shore towards the head of the Gulf, in search of remnants of ancient civilizations. The Pharaohs, ancient Greeks, and the Romans had all, at some point, had settlements here, but the scholars were not able to discover any ruins among the sands. But there was at least one known ancient site a few miles away. Napoleon and the scholars set off for a day trip down the coast, crossing the Gulf to the eastern Sinai shore by a sandbank, which was, at times, swallowed up by the tide of the sea. The purpose of this trip was to visit the Fountain of Moses, the natural springs at an oasis where, according to the Bible, Moses had led the Israelites to quench their thirst during their flight from Egypt. Pauline described how when they finally reached the springs, they used the water to make coffee, though its brackish taste made it barely drinkable. The Israelites had also found the water undrinkable, until Moses threw a tree into the pool, which had the miraculous effect of sweetening it. In the Bible, the Israelites had arrived at the oasis just after Moses had parted the waters of the Red Sea, allowing them to escape from Egypt, while, as the waters closed, it swept away the pursuing Pharaoh and his army. The French turned back for home late in the afternoon. The light was beginning to fade, and the rising tide was starting to cover the sandbank. The French rashly decided to ride on, but as the incoming tide swept in, the local guide lost his way in the dark. To amuse themselves, some soldiers had encouraged him to try alcohol, which had befuddled him. Napoleon and his entourage were soon in danger of being swept away like the pharaohs and his chariots. At one stage, the water became so deep that some of the horses were forced to swim, with their riders clinging on to their necks. Napoleon reacted quickly, collecting his escort around him in concentric circles. Napoleon then ordered them to ride forward, each in a straight line, and when one horse lost its footing and began to swim, they instead followed another still on firm ground, until all had a stable footing. In the commotion, Caffarelli's horse was swept from under him. Napoleon heard his shouts away back, and rode back to the spot, to find that he had lost his wooden leg, and he was refusing to follow his guides, telling them to let him drown, that it was useless that for his sake such brave men as them should die. Napoleon would hear none of it. I was angry, and struck him a blow in the face with my riding whip. If not for this, he would have been lost. With the help of one of the soldiers, Napoleon managed to drag the crippled general to safety. Eventually, all made it safely to the African shore by midnight. Pauline later played down the incident. We were not lost in the quicksand, as has been said. There weren't any of those. We couldn't see, but we cried out, calling to each other. However, later evidence suggests that they had indeed been in grave danger. Where they were, the tide rises to the height of 22 feet. Napoleon later joked, "Had I perished in that manner, like Pharaoh, it would have provided all the preachers in Christendom with a magnificent text against me." Napoleon was so grateful to the soldier who had helped save his friend, Caffarelli, that he promoted him to a corporal and awarded him a ceremonial sabre, engraved with General Bonaparte to the mounted guide Louis, crossing of the Red Sea. Such gestures were not rare, and Clabet scornfully noted in his pocketbook that they did much to establish Napoleon's popularity amongst his men. Indeed, Napoleon was already beginning to take on legendary status, as he was well aware, and certainly encouraged. although after the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon was the undisputed master of Egypt, the French still had to pursue the remnants of the Mamelukes. Their leader, Murad Bey, had retreated, with a few thousand of his horsemen, into Upper Egypt. At the end of August, Napoleon sent 3,000 men to pursue them, led by 30-year-old General Dizay, one of the greatest commanders of noble birth to ever rally to the French revolutionary cause. Dizay had first met Napoleon in Italy the year before, where, sharing a love of the Republic, they became good friends. Dizay single-handedly led an epic within an epic in Upper Egypt. After several bloody skirmishes, Dizay took possession of all Upper Egypt, as far south as the Cataracts. Following Napoleon's policy, Dizay became known and praised for his justice, showing himself so humane and friendly that the Egyptians knew him only by his nickname, the Just Sultan. They were never weary of contrasting Dizay's mild, merciful, yet effective government with the despotism of the Mamelukes. Because of this, the French army had no problems with provisions and was able to secure the safety of its rear and its communications. As well as his talents as a soldier, he showed such skill in governing that he was often favourably compared to his commander-in-chief, and Napoleon sang his friends' praises. Dizay is the embodiment of natural talent enhanced by education and work. Success in noble endeavours is his very life's breath. He is cast in the pure classical mould. But the most significant result of Dizay's campaign was the scholarly expedition that joined his army, which included Caffarelli and Denon, who led a team of 20 students from the École Polytechnique. Their mission was nothing less than to be the first Europeans since Caesar's legions to inventory and survey the remnants of a civilization 40 centuries old. Napoleon realized that if he wanted to get to know the Egyptians thoroughly, then he must discover what they had done and been in the past. But Egyptian history was, to Europeans and Egyptians alike, almost a complete blank. The greatest long-term achievements of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign were not military or strategic, but intellectual, cultural, and artistic. The scholars examined every object of interest and took accurate drawings of sphinxes, obelisks, temples, and sepulchral monuments. The artist Denon did sketches, mostly on my knee or standing, even on horseback, and without finishing even one as I should have liked. He even sketched while under the fire of the enemy. Among the antiquities he recorded for Europe were the Temple of Edfu, with Arab houses on its roofs, and Ptolemy's temple at Dendera, and after examining its perfectly preserved hall, supported by columns, Denon noted in his diary, "The Greeks invented nothing." The scholars discovered, one by one, temples built by 25 dynasties of pharaohs. Memphis, Abydos, Esneh, Dendera, Karnak, Luxor, Komombo, Edfu, the Colossi of Memnon, and Philae. Not even the toughest soldiers escaped emotion and the chill they experienced when they first beheld them. Captain de Vernois, who had been wounded 19 times, recalled the awe that they felt on seeing the Temple of Karnak. Without any order being given, the men formed into ranks and presented arms to the sound of drums and bugles. The splendor of the monuments being discovered made the expedition forget the extreme conditions of their existence, notably a severe epidemic of conjunctivitis, by which Dizay himself was almost nearly blinded. The only damage that occurred was some graffiti written on the stones, not all of which was the work of the French. The attitude of the people of the Nile Valley agreeably surprised the soldiers. At first intrigued by the work of the scholars, they quickly learned the deeper purpose of the project and intermingled with the troops, helping them measure the artifacts. As a result of Dizay's conquest, various treasures and stone artifacts were taken to Cairo, Rosetta, and Alexandria, intended to be displayed in Paris's new museum, the Louvre, as soon as ships arrived that could transport them. Due to the vastness of these discoveries, Napoleon decided to reinforce the first group of scholars with 2 commissions. One to record the topography of the Nile Valley, while the other was to study the strange wall inscriptions, the Hieroglyphics. The first volume of Danon's vast and magisterial description of Egypt was published in 1809, its first page proclaiming that it was published by order of His Majesty Emperor Napoleon the Great. Its preface recalled that Egypt had been invaded by Alexander and Caesar, whose missions there had been models for Napoleon's. For the rest of Napoleon's life, and indeed after it, more volumes of this extraordinary work appeared, finally numbering 21, a monument in the history of scholarship and publishing. The scholars missed nothing. They made immensely detailed scale drawings of obelisks, sphinxes, hieroglyphics, cartouches, as well as mummified birds, cats, snakes, and dogs. In these images, off-duty French soldiers were occasionally shown lounging around in the foreground of the prints, but this was for scale rather than just propaganda. As well as ancient Egyptology, the volumes contained exceptionally detailed maps of the Nile, modern cities and towns, prints of minarets and landscapes, sketches of irrigation, and drawings of monasteries and temples, different types of columns, views of shipping, souks, tombs, mosques, canals, fortresses, palaces, and citadels. These were encyclopedic architectural blueprints, accurate down to the last centimetre. Although not politically triumphalist, the description of Egypt represented the pinnacle of French, indeed Napoleonic culture, and had a profound effect on the artistic, architectural, and design taste of Europe. Additionally, having narrowly escaped being bitten by a horned serpent in a Theban grotto, Ripaut, the librarian of the Institute, wrote an 100-page report for the Commission of Arts on the existing state of antiquities from the Nile cataracts to Cairo. Napoleon also encouraged the study of the indecipherable hieroglyphics. The French accurately copied inscriptions from the key monuments. Indeed, they copied so many that they ran out of pencils, and Conte had to improvise new ones by melting down bullets and pouring the liquid into thin reeds taken from the Nile. But the scholars could still not make sense of the strange symbols. The truth emerged dramatically and from an unlikely source: a big, ugly black stone. During a session of the Institute in July 1799, the most important session held under Napoleon, a paper was read announcing the discovery at Rosetta of some inscriptions that may offer much interest. Chapillon, a brilliant young Frenchman who knew 9 Eastern languages, would follow up the clues provided by the Rosetta Stone to decipher hieroglyphics, which was the most important discovery made by Napoleon's expedition. The Rosetta Stone was to unlock not only hieroglyphics, but also the unknown world of Egyptian history. In doing so, it made the Egyptians aware of themselves as a people with a great past, and possibly with a great future. A few decades later, thanks to the friendly contacts established between Egyptian and French scientists, Sultan Muhammad Ali of Egypt, first in 1826, and then every year after, sent a number of students to France to pursue higher studies. Then, nearly 40 years after Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, in 1836, France also received the priceless gift of the ancient Luxor obelisk, which today stands proudly in the centre of the Place de la Concorde in Paris, to commemorate the services Napoleon and the French gave the Egyptian people. Their discoveries, along with the scientific and medical improvements introduced by Napoleon's scholars, opened Egypt up to the world, and led to an explosion of interest in all things Egyptian throughout Europe, a fascination that has never waned.